Once upon a time, in what was called the silly season, in the middle of a baking hot summer, there'd be nothing to talk about. Now I'm wondering how we're going to squeeze all of this in over the next 3 hours, as well as taking your calls on 0344 499 1000. You call us, we'll call you back and put you on the radio. You can also email me via the website at talkradio.co.uk. You can text me. Text the word talk, followed by your message to 87222, although that will cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. You can tweet me, though, for free at Talk Radio, at George Galloway. Don't forget to at both of us. Now, I've been struck, as must you have been, over these last years at just how difficult it has been for employees of the British Armed Forces deployed in unnecessary wars across the globe to get access to Britain with their families when the conflict turns sour and everyone's got to get out of there. I think, of course, most graphically of British Armed Forces translators in Iraq and in Afghanistan, some of whom have gone to an early grave when we scuttled out and refused them permission to come with us. Whatever your views on the wars, and mine are well enough known, it is utterly dishonourable behaviour and shames our country, as I said repeatedly and in public when these things were happening. Imagine my surprise, therefore, when it was reported over the weekend by the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, that he had responded to requests from Britain, France, the United States and Canada to, and I put this heavily in quotes, rescue 800 members of the so-called White Helmets from their last redoubt on the Golan Heights, to spirit them into Israel so that they could be forwarded to Britain, France, the United States and Canada. That's the United States with its Muslim list and its determination to root out Johnny Foreigner at every possible opportunity. That's Britain, which has taken a tiny scintilla of the world refugee flow from the wars in which we have been intimately involved. We are taking the White Helmets. As my first guest this morning put it, it's a bit like being told we're going to evacuate the leadership of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and bring them, clasp them to our bosom. Although, as that writer pointed out, we did, in fact. Not a lot of people know this. It's one of the problems about growing older, that you're increasingly the only person who remembers these truths. The writer, who's about to join us, did point out that Britain and the United States continued to vote annually in the United Nations for Pol Pot to keep the country's seat on the United Nations long after he'd been toppled from power. That guest is John Wright, journalist and broadcaster, novelist, writer, and one of the smartest people around. Andrew Woodcock of the Press Association also joins us to talk about the truly extraordinary place that Britain and politics in Britain now finds itself in. In the Sunday Times, epic polling and writing around that polling just yesterday, some very, very profound shifts in the tectonic plates of British politics were recorded actually in detail for the first time. Mrs. May's Chequers proposals, which you will recall, Dan the Corbyn man, Dan Hodges, and others, hailed on this very show a couple of Fridays ago as a huge success, now has the support of just 12% of the British people. And a very large segment of the Leave voting population in Britain is preparing, if it can, to shift its support from the Conservatives to a real Brexit party. Now, no real Brexit party exists right at this moment, because UKIP has gone off to the wild shores of race-baiting, Islamophobia, and has transformed itself under its current leadership into the political wing of the English Defence League, knocking over policewomen as they go. But that might not prevail for much longer. If Nigel Farage, just sacked from a local London radio station, comes back to the leadership of a real Brexit party, which rebrands, renames itself, the Tories are in even more desperate trouble. They will lose getting on for 40% of their vote in the country, losing potentially scores, if not hundreds, of their parliamentary seats. It is a profound shift indeed. And Andrew Woodcock will bring us up to date on that, including on whether the pro-Chequers party inside the Conservative Party might soon be joined by Chuka Amuna and other Blairite Europhile members of the Labour Party. This morning, as most mornings to be honest, Donald Trump took to Twitter in an entirely capitalized, that is, every letter a capital letter, and my goodness, he took the full number of characters in which to say it. He threatened nuclear holocaust on the Islamic Republic of Iran. What could possibly go wrong? What could possibly justify this threat of nuclear annihilation of a country in the Middle East, next door, as the wind blows, to some of America's closest allies? We'll be talking to Peter Oborne of the Spectator and the Middle East Eye and the Daily Mail Group, one of the savviest writers on the right in British politics, to discuss where Trump goes next. We'll be talking to Vanessa Beeley, the daughter, I should say, of one of Anthony Eden's cabinet members at the time of Suez, who knows a thing or two about the canal running through Sir Anthony Eden's drawing room, about the situation in Syria now, as ISIS and Al-Qaeda teeter on the brink of total, final defeat. Not, repeat, not at the hands of Britain, France, and the United States, that did everything in their power to boost and help and arm and finance and propagandize for ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, but at the hands of the Syrian Arab Army and its allies. And we'll be talking to Chris Phillips, reader in international relations at Queen Mary University in London, on the revelation that not only does Novichok fail 3 times out of 4, but that the latest survivor has also been taken to a safe house And according to his brother, in that safe house is no television. Why would Charlie Rowley be forbidden access to television? In the words of Alice through the looking glass, curiouser and curiouser. I just shocked my redoubtable producer, and she's not easily shocked. The lovely Cass did not know that I went to see the ABBA stage show twice, and that I saw Mamma Mia 1, and that I'm interested in talking to Caroline Frost, if you're listening, about Mamma Mia 2. Mamma Mia might have been the cry when we discovered that 800 Islamist fanatic extremists, 800, on top of all those we've already got, all those who came back from fighting for ISIS and Al-Qaeda and re-entered this country without a whimper from the authorities, we're about to bring 800 more. Though, to be fair, we're only taking a share of them. I don't know, maybe 200 head-chopping, heart-eating, Islamist fanatic extremists. What could possibly go wrong? Who are they? Well, they've got white hats, but that doesn't make them good guys. John Wright, the Scottish journalist, writer, novelist, and commentator, broadcaster, and all-round sage, joins me now. John, thanks for coming on the show.
Good morning, George.
It is remarkable, isn't it, that British Army translators who risked their lives working for the British Armed Forces in the various wars that they'd been led into over the last decade and a half can't get into Britain, but with a wave of a magic wand, an Israeli rescue operation, and these chaps are on their way here.
Indeed, it's certainly evidence that the wheels have come right off Britain's foreign policy and policy towards Syria, and by extension the West's policy with regard to the Syrian conflict. This was a British, largely, asset in the conflict, serving a propaganda purpose. Certainly I don't suggest that not all of these individuals were not involved in civil defence and were involved for pure motives, but there is an abundance of evidence, footage, photographic footage,
including their own footage.
Indeed, and personal testimony from people who have been liberated from opposition-controlled territory, that their function was far more nefarious than we have been led to believe. They were set up by a former British military officer, James Le Mesurier, who also had a career in the murky world of private security contractor with mercenary companies, to give them their proper name, set up in 2013 in conjunction with the then recognised, that is Western recognised, Syrian opposition in exile, the Syrian National Council, and the Qataris. The British UK taxpayer has devoted £38.4 million to this group since 2013. This figure came to light recently on the back of a Freedom of Information request. Now, I suggest that £38.4 million buys you a hell of a lot of water hoses, ladders, hard hats and torches. And does anyone seriously believe that every single penny of that money remained in the coffers of the White Helmets, given that they operated and continue to operate solely in opposition-held territory in Syria, which means to say territory dominated by various Salafi jihadi groups? Indeed, the more cynical among us, the more sceptical, myself included, would suggest that perhaps that was one of the functions of the White Helmets, to act as a conduit to enable monies to be funneled to these various groups, because we know that superseding any danger involved from these Salafi jihadi groups, the plethora of terrorist attacks that have been carried out in the West, superseding that danger was the strategic objective of overthrowing the government of Bashar al-Assad.
Now, John, for many of the listeners, especially in this slot, not used to me and my guests, there will be a certain degree of bemusement that Britain ended up, after all the anti-terror talk, the war on terror, 9/11, the Afghan war, the Iraq war, the Libya war, that Britain ended up on the same side as the same kind of people that run amok whenever they can on railway bridges in London?
Well, I think we have to disabuse ourselves from the notion that we are always the good guys in this Western that we are invited to believe is our role in the world, that we are the guys in the white hats, the force for good in the world, and that we never involve ourselves in any nefarious activities, or that when we do, they are out of keeping with our cultural values. They are mistakes. Whereas if countries such as Russia are accused of, for example, carrying out airstrikes in which civilians are killed, well, that is entirely in keeping with their cultural values, which are reflective of barbarism. The fact of the matter is, George, that the British foreign policy establishment's strategic relationship with radical Islam goes back decades, indeed all the way to the end of the First World War, and most notoriously in the context of the conflict in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where SAS, Special Forces, along with their US counterparts, it is a matter of historical record. We're training these mujahideen warriors, holy warriors they call themselves, many would call them terrorists, in camps in Pakistan to go and fight in Afghanistan in order to serve what were then the country's strategic objective of undermining the Soviet Union, which had intervened in that conflict on the side of the country's legitimate government, a progressive government, in which the rights of minorities, especially women, were upheld. And everyone knows the disaster that turned out that ensued on the back of that foreign policy adventure. We know that British military trainers have been involved in training Saudi forces in regards to the conflict in Yemen. This came to light in the Daily Mail at the end of last year. 50 British soldiers were involved in this covert operation known as Operation Crossways. This begs the question of, is that the only training operation that British forces have been involved in that region? I'm not one of those that views the conflict in Yemen and the conflict in Syria in isolation from one another. They're part of an overarching strategic objective. I go back to my point that our strategic objectives in terms of fashioning the world in our image in very strategically vital areas of the world as far as they are concerned, such as the Middle East, supersede any risks involved to civilians here at home. And the real question that people have to grapple with regards to this development with the evacuation of these individuals from Syria is the Manchester bombing in 2017, the circumstances surrounding that. You've asked some hard questions about the role of these former members of the Libyan Islamic fighting group, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, who were chased out of the country in 2010 by Gaddafi, and then when the so-called revolution broke out there in 2011, were aided in their efforts to go back there by MI6 to take part in that so-called revolution. Salman al-Abedi's father was key in that group, and Salman al-Abedi himself, the Manchester bomber, went over there and fought briefly in that conflict and received military training, after which he returned to carry out his vile act. These are serious questions that people need to grapple with, because they're reflective of this country's malign legacy of dirty wars all over the Middle East, in Africa and Kenya, and closer to home in Ireland.
Now, I'm almost speechless to hear you remind everyone about the Salman Abedi affair, the Manchester Arena atrocity against small children, that this man who carried that out, and his father and his brother, were all effectively British intelligence assets immediately prior to the atrocity that was carried out. And you're right that I have asked difficult questions. Unfortunately, I haven't received, and no one has received, even the most basic of answers. But in the time left available, returning to the white helmets, what's going to happen with them? Are they going to come back here and remain a cell like the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group? In which case, who's going to be monitoring them? Are we going to be paying them? Are we paying? We've already paid them with the king's ransom that you mentioned. These must be white gold helmets with that kind of money. And that's just the British money. The American money was even more spectacular. Are we paying for this evacuation? And will we be paying for the hundreds, presumably, who are going to be resettled here?
Yes, we certainly are. We're going to be, some of them are going to be resettled here, according to what I know of this issue. Others in Canada and others in France have all committed to taking some of this group. So it suggests that they would be housed, they would be set up with some kind of income. But the real question is what they were involved in while they were in Syria, and the alacrity with which they have been evacuated, quote unquote, from southwestern Syria by the Israelis with the cooperation of the British government suggests that these people know where the bodies are buried, and it's very important to get them out of there before they come into the hands of Syrian government forces. This conforms to a pattern we saw in Douma, and don't forget the white helmets who were stationed there at that time were key in the propaganda regarding a nerve agent attack that had been carried out there earlier this year, which the OPCW just confirmed after an on-site investigation that no nerve gas was used in Douma. And the white helmets have been key in following out information that has suited the narrative of the British government when it comes to demonising the Syrian government, Russia, and their forces operating in the country entirely legally to try and restore the country's sovereignty and to chase these head-chopping fanatics out of the country. And I tell you who else has questions to answer in regards to this development, and that's our mainstream media. Because instead of asking these hard questions that we are asking now, they have all, to a man and woman almost, fallen into line behind the government's narrative. And not only that, they've attacked those who've been asking these hard questions and painted them as conspiracy theorists and Putin apologists and Assad stooges and all the rest. These people should be hanging their heads in shame as we speak right now, given the contours of this conflict and how it's playing out.
John White, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Now remember, if you have a point of view that is contrary to mine, your calls are especially welcome and will be prioritised, as will the calls of women, as will first-time callers. The number to dial is 0344 499 1000. You call us, we'll ring you back. Needn't cost you more than a penny or two. Daniel in Addleston has done just that. That's why he's on the air now. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Yeah, good morning, George.
Good morning, sir.
How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Yeah, no, disclosure, I'm a man. I called in before, and I have the same view as you. So
that's okay. You're just as welcome, Daniel.
Right. But no, one thing I believe you've got Vanessa Beeley coming up.
Yes, we do, yes.
But perhaps you could mention about this underground city that was in Ghouta, you know, all this time that it was being bombarded.
Yes.
They had this, maybe, and that's because that's really weird, isn't it? With, going on about the white helmets and that, how they survived with the terrorists for years and years and years.
Yes. It's not rocket science. There are literally hundreds of hours of footage of these white helmets participating in the murderous executions of priests, of teachers, of Christians, of Muslims who didn't agree with them. They stand by, and as soon as the head comes off, they whisk the corpse away. There are hundreds of photographs of people in these white helmets posing for pictures with people about to be beheaded and murdered in cold blood. And now they're coming here, Daniel.
Right. Well, one thing, I don't want to make too light of the subject, but putting the two together, I'm thinking maybe we could have them in Salisbury because they seem to be immune to chemical attacks.
Well, that's a point that we'll be dealing with later on whether or not it was a chemical attack. Because I've formed the very clear view very early that there was no nerve agent attack in Douma, and there was no Novichok nerve agent attack in Salisbury either. Some other substance is responsible for the 3 out of 4 failures in the Salisbury-Amesbury case. Yeah. But we'll come on to that later, Daniel.
Yeah, no, these white helmets, though, I mean, the gentleman that was on beforehand, the Libyan Fighting Group, or whatever it was called, the ones that were...
The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. The clue was in the name, Daniel.
Yeah. Well, there's not Islamic, that's for sure. They were here. Again, we know there were pictures of that Manchester bomber the morning that he done the attack, wasn't there? There was pictures of it.
Well, they were not only here, they were concentrated in Manchester and in a small part of Manchester. And I was living quite nearby. And they were systematically settled there, given their freedom there. The tags that they originally had were removed by the Gordon Brown government. Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary, gave them back their passports. Britain's MI6 facilitated their passage from Britain to Libya and back again, over and over again.
Germany. That matey Al Bardi, whatever his name is, he stopped off at Germany like 3 days before he carried out the Manchester bombing or something. They just let him through.
Don't you think it's funny how the Manchester bombing affair has such little prominence in our national life, in the national narrative? I can't help think that it's suspicious.
But then as well, why is it that the City Council got elected to the Grenfell? The same people that were responsible for Grenfell, they've been re-elected. Again, sometimes I wonder, we the British people deserve what we get.
Well, of course, in a democracy, you get the government that you vote for. Yeah.
One thing I would say as well, what's his name? That's Savage today, is where he's saying that the Beatles, or those two mates, they've got to go to America and be killed.
Why not? Why not? I would have killed them on sight. I would have killed them on sight myself. I think it's extraordinary. David Lammy is on Twitter this morning denouncing the government for refusing to object to the execution in the United States of a group of people who literally cut the heads off
I would be interested to hear what they have to say first, who they worked for, what they were doing there, before they just got killed off and then disappeared.
I don't feel that there's any doubt who they were working for. And so, as far as I'm concerned, when the last Al-Qaeda and ISIS man lies dead on the ground, we'll be in a safer place. Daniel in Addleston, thanks very much for your call. Stephen on Twitter says, Labour members, you can either tune in to a London local station and hear another hour on the fake anti-Semitism row, or hear about its real motives on Talk Radio with George Galloway at 10 a.m. Thank you, Stephen. John V. Hayes says, you are ranting, Mr. Galloway. Please return to normal speech mode. Am I? John? Really? Stephen says, I'm now looking forward to hearing a more balanced view on Labour and the fake anti-Semitism row, rather than the one-sided view on a London local station. Mark Challoner says, fair play to George Galloway. I haven't heard any MSM outlets prepared to admit that the so-called white helmets have been supporting terrorists. We don't want them here, George. We have enough problems with crime already. Don't we just, Mark? Don't we just? David Lindsay says, well, that's the end of any doubt then. The white helmets are IS and Al-Qaeda, who are Saudi Arabia, which is us, and Israel, which is also us. And David says, among other things, we need to demand that we divert to our own emergency services the money that we send to the white helmets and to the Free Syrian Police. Bambolio says, seriously, it's time for Jeremy Corbyn to bring you back into the fold. It's open war now. And David says, so far Novichok has had 4 victims, 3 of whom are alive, 2 of whom are well, and 1 of whom looks better than she did before. From now on, Vlad, I'd send a bloke with a gun. Well, actually, a polythene bag over the head is much more efficient than your old Novichok. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. You call us, we'll call you back and put you on the radio. Now, Andrew Woodcock is the political editor at the Press Association. He knows what's going down in the Houses of Parliament and in Whitehall, for that matter. Andrew, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, George.
These are pretty unprecedented times, and I speak as someone in politics for 50 years. The tectonic plates are shifting, are they not? And didn't the Sunday Times epic polling yesterday and the reportage around it show just how fluid everything now is?
It certainly did. I mean, it makes quite scary reading for the leaders of the traditional parties, because it suggests that there is appetite out there in the country for a recasting of the political landscape, and that people are not necessarily at all wedded to the existing lineup of parties that they're being offered. Conservatives don't necessarily like the Conservative policy on Brexit. Labour supporters don't necessarily like what Jeremy Corbyn is offering them, and there's appetite out there for different kinds of parties. Having said that, the British political system is remarkably resistant to the creation of new parties. If you look at what happened to the SDP, they had, 25, 30% in the polls, I think, at one point, and they still vanished without trace.
Yeah, they actually polled, I think, 27% in 1983 and didn't get that many MPs for it, and then not long afterwards were dead.
Indeed, and that is what stands basically in the way of anyone considering launching a new party. I know there's a lot of talk here at Westminster about the possibility, is there a centrist party? There's a lot of centrist voters out there in the country. There's a lot of people who see the two main parties drifting to the extremes. But people here are very reluctant to do anything meaningful about starting a new party, because they look at the SDP, they think that's exactly the same fate would befall them. And instead, they try to fight on within the boundaries of their existing party structures. And the one exception at the moment appears to be Vince Cable, who appears to be actively seeking out possible parties for what he calls or partners rather, for what he calls a realignment of British politics.
Yes, and we had a guest on Friday night who had certain knowledge that Alistair Campbell had been ringing people up, quite well-known people, and asking them if they'd be prepared to be candidates for Parliament for an imminent new party. So I personally think that it is on. Do you think so?
Well, I think if you've got people like Alistair Campbell, who is absolutely tribal Labour, I mean, you've spoken about it in the past that, Labour runs through his bloodstream. If it's people like him that are actively involved, and I've got no evidence that they have, but you say you talk to someone who's got knowledge of this, that indicates the extent to which we're living in unprecedented times. I think there are certainly people from all of the major parties, I think, who've been having conversations about this. Actually going to the taking the extra step of taking actual action to make it a reality. It's a big step to take.
Yes, let's unpick the polling a little bit. Only 2 Fridays ago, I had some eminent journalists on here, and 1 or 2 others, who were hailing Theresa May's Chequers ultimatum and her Chequers proposals as simply wizard. And yet this polling suggests that only 12% of the British people support those Chequers proposals.
It's interesting, that, isn't it? It's Theresa May is presented with contradictory and possibly mutually incompatible demands on her, that she has to deliver the result of a binary yes-no question, which was asked to the British people. They came up with an answer. It was a relatively narrow decision, but it was a decision nonetheless. It's a yes-no thing. And she's got a...
Yeah, it was more than a million vote. It was more than a million of a majority, yeah.
Yes, and no one doubts that majority. But she then has to also... she's got the imperatives of keeping the British economy running smoothly, satisfying businesses who are scared of what will happen when Brexit actually takes place, and she's tried to combine those two things, tried to come up with some sort of compromise solution. But I think the British public, having been offered a binary choice in the first place, they're not in the mood for a compromise solution. An awful lot of them think, we voted to leave, let's just leave. Mm-hmm. And any compromise seems like a betrayal. It seems like that they're being let down. It seems like they're having the wool pulled over their eyes. I think that's the way a lot of people are looking at this. And so they don't go through the details, I wouldn't imagine, of her white paper. They look at it and say she's sold out. And that is what a lot of people are thinking. And that is an enormous problem for her, because, as we know, she's going out today to North East to try to sell her Brexit plan. She's going to be doing a tour of Europe to try and sell it. But she's selling it to people who basically have been told this is a yes-no deal.
Yes, I mean, it's a sort of oxymoron, her going on tour, because she fought the last general election in deserted warehouses. with a clack of party officials gathered round to look like an audience, with the media collaborating in the photo angles, by and large. She doesn't do people very well. The idea that she's going to go around the country selling something only 12% of the people are ready to buy before she starts strikes me as very unlikely.
It certainly doesn't play to her advantages or her strengths as a politician. I don't think she's certainly not someone who likes to get in there and get to the guts of an argument and persuade people. She prepares her sound bites, she puts them across, she repeats over and over again. It's for her, politics seems to be more a sort of a balancing act of keeping her party together and finding a form of words that everyone is happy with, and then putting that across. Now, whether that is what is required when you have an electorate out there who are, at the very best, they're very dubious about what she's offering. It would take a great persuader, one of the real orators of British politics of the past, to persuade people to follow her on this sort of a route. And she's in a position where she doesn't even have secure confidence in being able to get a majority in Parliament, let alone in the country.
Well, on that point, Andrew, the reason I called it unprecedented in my earlier words is this. My reading is there is no majority in the House of Commons for either or any or either of the propositions on offer, because we can no longer say that because the leader says we're going this way, that the members of Parliament are going to follow them. That's just as true on the Labour, maybe more true on the Labour side than it is on the Conservative. So given how narrow the votes were last week, it seems to me when push comes to shove that nothing actually in terms of Brexit can pass the House of Commons, which is why I think Rees-Mogg, though I didn't hear the interview or the statement, Rees-Mogg said we're headed for a WTO exit in March because no other form can go through the House. Even that one couldn't go through the House, but that is the default position.
Yes, I think that is correct. I think where you get victories in the House of Commons for a particular type of Brexit, it is because people are voting to hold their party together and to keep the show on the road, rather than because there is any majority in Parliament for a particular kind of Brexit. I think it's possible, in fact, that Jeremy Corbyn's Brexit, with remaining within the single market and a customs union of some sort or another, that may well be able to command a very, very narrow majority. It would depend how many rebels on his side, because there's several people on the Labour side who want a hard Brexit themselves. I think that there is possibly a majority for that, and then it's something that quite possibly they'll never be given an opportunity.
Well, no, I don't think he could propose that. He could not propose that for his own personal reasons, but more importantly, that 65% plus of Labour-held constituencies voted Leave. 5 million Labour voters, 5 million voted Leave. And if it were perceived that Corbyn had sold them out in the way that Theresa May is being accused of selling her voters out, Labour would be decimated in any subsequent election.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's not in Labour's interest for that sort of a vote to be forced, and that sort of vote, I don't think there's any circumstances where it would be forced. I'm just saying that the actual majority amongst MPs could be for.
Yes, I agree with you on that. I think that is the actual position of a majority, a plurality in the House of Commons. I agree with that.
But as you say, the default is if they can't come up with anything, because of the way the votes went over the last few weeks, there isn't a final say for Parliament, for the MPs. There's this default option that if you don't agree to what the government has offered, we end up on the WTO rules, we end up leaving without a deal, which is the most dramatic and potentially chaotic version of Brexit. It's something which there's no question at all. There isn't a majority for it in Parliament. I think you would struggle to get 100 MPs to vote for that.
Yeah.
And yet it is becoming more and more likely that is the option
because it is because it's the default.
The others are unacceptable to people.
Yeah, because it's the default position. In the absence of any other position with a majority, that is the one that comes into being. Now, Google, or was it Amazon? I think it was Amazon. I'm not sure why they're opining on great. Yeah, I don't know why they're opining on great political issues of the day. Perhaps it's because they pay so much tax. But they said that this would cause actual civil unrest in Britain. That's a rather dramatic prediction, isn't it?
I think they're talking about that as their worst case scenario that they need to be ready to deal with if necessary. They're not actually predicting it, but they see it as the worst in a possible range of outcomes of a no-deal Brexit. And I think they look at it and they think, well, what if food supplies from the continent dry up because you have lorries queuing at Dover and Calais, all packed with food which is rotting away while they try to get through customs checks. They think, what happens if computer systems go down? There's all sorts of nightmare scenarios. Planes stopping, being stopped from leaving because they haven't got the right safety checks and so on.
This is just Project Fear. This is just Project Fear, Andrew, isn't it? There's no truckfuls of foreign food rotting away from other countries that are outside the European Union on Europe's borders.
No, I think it's more a case of you've got this sort of unprecedented uncertainty about what will happen, and I think most people assume that in this scenario, then what would actually happen is that the authorities on both sides of the channel would step in and say, we don't want these things to happen, we're going to work out a workaround, we'll make sure that things carry on running smoothly, and then we'll try and sort out new arrangements. Yeah. But it's sort of following the logic of the rules and the arrangements that are already in place and saying if those rules are taken away, then you have nothing to guide you.
Yeah.
And I suppose, if you're a businessman, you've got to look at it and say that is a plausible scenario. We have to prepare for it, however unlikely it might be.
Andrew, you're a sage. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Andrew Woodcock, political editor at the Press Association. Chris says on the SMS, for years now it has become obvious that the West are no longer the good guys. I have absolutely no trust anymore in Western foreign policy. And Donald Putin, can you explain to me why Israel are sticking their beak into Syria now? Never been out of it, Mr. Putin. Marek says yesterday was the 13th anniversary of the wrongful and racist-driven death of Jean-Charles de Menezes. I learned of his tragic death from Roger Waters at his concert at Yankee Stadium in New York. 13 years since poor Jean-Charles was gunned down on the London Underground with, I think, 5 bullets to the head. Stuart Collins says, hello, George. What absolutely sickening madness. Our government inviting these white helmet allies of ISIS and other head-chopping groups to settle in the UK, to commit God knows what type of carnage in the future. This is madness and an insult to the victims of terrorism. Indeed, it's totally remarkable, only bested by the fact that all the media are going along with it. Lizzie says, what is the government doing, letting in the white helmets, who are probably Islamist mercenaries? Also, Theresa's appeasing cabinet on an away day to suggest devolved powers in the north, thus creating thousands of jobs. Just more bureaucrats, less real jobs. Devolve means ceding responsibility and more division. And Danny says, this Novichok that the Russians apparently used only has a 25% success rate. It has affected 4 people, 3 of them are alive, 2 of them are well, and 1 of them looks better than they did before. And Peter in Glasgow says, wonderful news that Campbell is phoning around for traitors for his new party. The sooner the parasites leave the Labour Party, the better. Well, I must say, that's my view. And if it were to be done, Peter, better that it were done quickly. This death by 1,000 cuts is ultimately far more damaging and debilitating for the Labour cause than a clean break. But then I'm for a clean break Brexit too. Now, shortly I'll be talking to Peter Oborne of the Spectator, the Mail and the Middle East Eye on the developing crisis between the United States and Iran. But first, let's take a call from Jeff in Hull. Go ahead, Jeff.
Good morning, Mr. Galloway. Thank you for having me on the show. A slice of heaven listening, as always.
Thank you so much. How kind.
I have a pretty good idea regarding, well, I'd like to cover all the oxygen thieves you've been talking about over the next couple of minutes. I'll try not to take over your show, but talking about these white helmets,
yes,
they are oxygen thieves at the very highest level. I have an idea. What we should invite them in, like they do, play the game, we'll be all nice to them, get them all here, invite them all in, and then we arrest a lot of them, execute them all live on Sky TV, pay-to-view, and all the money we make goes to the people, the relatives of the people who were murdered, because they are murderers of the highest degree. We shouldn't even be talking to them, never mind letting them in this country.
Well, of course, we invented them. I think this is a point that so few know. A British Army officer.
With our arm around them because we actually made them and we're frightened to death of what they're going to go and say.
Well, that was the point that John Wright made earlier. I myself hadn't thought of that particular angle, that perhaps they can put them in the safe houses that the Skripals and Charlie Rowley are now in, without a television and, most importantly, without a telephone.
Correct. Absolutely 100%, George. We seem to do this regularly around the world. We invent these groups to fight other groups, and then when these groups decide, oh, well, we want some of what they've got, then they go off with their own agenda, and then later on we've got to backtrack and give them a cuddle, a pat on the head and a biscuit and invite them to come and live here where it's lovely.
Yeah, it is lovely, green and pleasant land indeed, but will be less lovely when we've got even more of these types in our midst, and we're not short of these types in our midst already.
Talking about oxygen thieves and terrorists, two things I'd like to say. One, we're talking about Israel. They're the biggest terrorists this planet has ever known. Anybody who would fire a rocket from a helicopter at a guy in a wheelchair, regardless of what he's done as he's coming out of his place of worship, that is not a country that has the best interests of the people of the planet at heart. The Israelis are terrorists as well. They have their own agenda.
Well, not all Israelis, of course. There are many good Israelis that are out there demonstrating against Mr. Ned. I mean, this very morning, Jeff, Daniel Barenboim, arguably the greatest living Israeli, the concert pianist, conductor, musical genius, maestro, he said this morning that he was ashamed to be an Israeli. So there are many good Israelis. We must be careful about tarring everyone with the same brush.
I agree, and my apologies for putting a blanket statement in there. I too have a couple of Jews who are very, very good friends.
Well, Jews and Israelis are two different things, of course.
They are both Israelis. They're both Jewish Israelis, and they both hate the system. And they actually left the country because of the system that they operate.
Well, that is one of the dilemmas. I myself have many Israeli friends, but few of them any longer live in Israel, which means that the proportion of progressive Israelis is shrinking fast. I used to stay with them in Shankin Street near Dizengoff Square in Tel Aviv, and some of the finest people and bravest people on the earth they were too, but they long ago now went into exile, as people like them increasingly do.
And George, on the third point, talking of oxygen thieves yet again, Theresa May. I mean, in reality, you wouldn't let this woman loose with the remote control to a TV, would you?
No, you wouldn't. As we say in Glasgow, you wouldn't send her out for a loaf.
No, she'd get lost on the way back. Now, the thing is, she's going to do this whistle-stop tour and go to the north, and she's in these meetings that she's going to hold, that is going to be all orchestrated for the press. All that's going to be there are party members who are rounded up to make it look like a big crowd.
Yeah, I mean, she can't do that kind of politics.
No, she's a liar. And everybody, tell her to come to Hull and stand in the city square and stand on a box and see what reaction she gets in Hull or Newcastle or Darlington or one of these places that her government has decimated.
It's astonishing, but it's desperate, isn't it, Jeff? That's the point. When she saw that poll in the Sunday Times yesterday, I mean, what are you going to do? You either shrug and resign, or you take it onto the road. And taking it onto the road is so not her forte.
Oh, she's got more front than Marks and Spencer's. It's amazing. I mean, if she was to come to the northeast and stand there in a square on a box and show her true colours, she can't speak to the public because she doesn't do public. She doesn't do people. I mean, we've got a woman in charge of Brexit who was absolutely with the back of her teeth against Brexit.
Yes.
Who was about to.
And her chancellor next door.
Correct. Now, what they're going to produce is a Brexit by name, but exactly the same as we've got by nature.
Yeah.
And another thing I'd like to say as well that was brought up today, George. I'm sorry to rattle on, but
no, I've enjoyed talking to you.
What I would also like to say is this: can we just put to bed once and for all these tattooed, useless? I won't say the word, but you know what I'm going to say. That's constantly spout this. Oh, it was just a tiny majority that won the Brexit vote.
No, it was well over 1 million votes.
2 million people.
Yeah.
1.2 million people was the majority. That is not a minority.
No, and neither is it a small majority when you put it like that. Jeff, in Hull, been a pleasure talking to you. The communicipalist says, I have for some time now opined on Twitter that no deal is the only deal Brussels could ever countenance. The last thing the European commissioners want is an exit protocol that becomes part of the body of European case law. And Terry Eaton says, my view is a quick, clean Brexit. Get rid of the fifth columnist Blairites, and off we go with our true socialist party. The sooner the better, George. 0344 499 1000. Now, Peter Oborne is a man of letters, author and prodigious journalist, and something of a sage when it comes to international affairs. And that's the kind of chap we like. Peter Oborne, welcome to the show.
Ah, yes. I'm speaking as a fifth columnist Blairite. I'm delighted to be on your show.
Can I go left field for a minute, Peter? I didn't ask you on for this, so forgive me. I'm just looking at this extraordinary business of students defacing the Kipling poem, If. Now, of course, Rudyard Kipling was an empire loyalist, and therefore, as empire is built on feelings of racial superiority, no doubt we'd call him a racist. But the poem has nothing racist in it. Indeed, a very large number of black people of my acquaintance have got it on their wall. Are you puzzled, bemused by this latest development?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say to everybody listening, if you haven't read If, get a copy, read it. It's one of the greatest poems in the English
Well, I'm glad
language.
you said that, because I think the same.
The other thing is, go and read the book Kim. I mean, I think it's... My view is Kipling was the greatest British writer of the 20th century. Yes, he started life as a young reporter I think it was in Peshawar, in northwest, on the northwest frontier, the Frontier Times. And of course, he imbued many of the racist sentiments of the British upper class. But that book, Kim, is a very great book. It is an extraordinary insight into empire, but more than that, into Buddhism. And the Great West Road, the Great Trunk Road, is a character in that book. And it is about the Great Game, and Kim gets recruited as a British agent. But wow, what a book! It's a work of literature.
Well, look, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for that because
it's a precursor to the greatest book of the 20th century, which is Gabriel Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude.
A wonderful, truly wonderful book. Yes,
because it has magical realism. It's that I try and reread Kim every year. It is. Just talking about it.
Well, I haven't read it, but I now will on your recommendation. But generally speaking, we shouldn't deface works of art, works of culture, because of the perceived political views of their author. Should we? I mean, I'd have to destroy all my Bob Dylan records if that were true. I mean, isn't politics and art two different things?
Yeah, I think, Shakespeare. You have to go to, Shakespeare's full of racism and anti-Semitism and all kinds of attitudes to women, which would be deemed improper today. Look, this is nonsense. I do sympathise. I don't actually agree, but I definitely sympathise with those who want, say, to take down the statue of Rhodes in Oxford University.
Yeah, I mean, he was not an artist. He was a brigand who killed and stole from the African people their land and patrimony.
Exactly. I don't think that is different. But to start to declare that certain writers, artists are unacceptable, and some are. I mean, it does. Sometimes art does veer into propaganda. You wouldn't, the Nazi artists of the 1930s. I don't think I would be very sympathetic to somebody who said we don't want to hear from them ever again. But I think Kim is a different matter. I think that Kipling, is a different matter. He's a truly great artist, and you cannot apply the values of the early 21st century to the artists of the past, and you it's a form of Bowdlerization. There was a maniac, a cleric called Bowdler, who got hold of Shakespeare's plays in the 19th century and took all the bits about sex out. And now we've got these demented, politically correct types who are taking everything which is offensive to the modern sensibility out, and it's the same thing.
Well, talking of Shakespeare, what about that tweet from Donald Trump this morning, all in capital letters, threatening Iran with the nuclear holocaust? That's demented, isn't it?
Well, it's terrifying, actually. I mean, I do feel that the world is in a very dangerous place. There's clearly this tweet maybe looks very mad, but he's got to remember the beating drums for war against Iran are growing all the time. There was a conference in Paris recently attended by conservative MPs calling for regime change within a year. John Bolton, the national security advisor, called for it a year ago. So America wants to go to war with Iran. It's being endlessly provocative. This is demented. It's mad. He's torn down that great achievement of Obama's, the deal about nuclear about nuclear plants in Iran. It scares me.
I mean, let's look at the.
By the way, I've been looking at Trump's tweets in the past. I did a book.
Yeah, you did a book on it.
And there's a lot of them in which he attacks. He says that Obama, in order to raise his poll ratings, is about to attack Iran.
I've been looking at some of those today. At least 3 times, he pressed the alarm klaxon that Obama was in such desperate trouble. He'd probably attack Iran next.
Yeah, I'm just calling them up. Yeah, I mean, for instance, here we have it. Yeah, in order to get elected, Barack Obama will start a war with Iran. That's that's one of them.
Unbelievable.
Just as I predicted, Obama is preparing a possible attack on Iran right before the November elections. That's what he tweeted 5 years ago. So,
demented isn't the word. And let's look at the chronology, Peter. He threatened Iran with war. Iran said, if you make war on us, you'll regret it. And Trump bounces back, don't you dare threaten America.
Yes, there is a double standard here. But I must say, there is a big issue here. Trump was popularly elected. The American democratic system threw up this maniac. What do you do about it? He is a maniac and he is dangerous.
Well, Europe said that it wouldn't go along with breaking down the Iran nuclear deal, but as the United States has insisted that it will financially penalize vast financial penalties, any European country continuing to do business with Iran, that's all beginning to rattle down now too, isn't it?
That is, I must say, this is a very strong argument, by the way, for a strong European Union, which both of us oppose. But if we all got together and refused to allow Western European companies to be blackmailed by the US then we could because what they're saying, the US is saying, we're using the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency of the world to mean that we will financially punish any British, French, German, Italian company which does business with Iran. And if we collectively stood together and said we will not allow that to happen, we could succeed. And I think we should, because this is a gross abuse of the reserve currency status of the dollar.
Yes, I mean, their claim of extraterritoriality so far as US law has long been applied, for example, in relation to European companies doing business with Cuba. A French bank, a state-owned bank in France, was penalized to the tune of $7 billion and paid it for doing business with Cuba. But what could possibly go wrong, Peter? Iran is a country of 70 million people. It has the highest proportion of young people under the age of 27 of any country in the world. It is fervently patriotic. Even those who hate the regime will rally behind their country under attack from the United States. Is even Trump mad enough to launch a military attack?
Well, let's say, first of all, look, there are all kinds of human rights issues with Iran. There are all kinds of problems with the regime. Both of us can say that.
Indeed. I just turned down an invitation from them this morning on exactly those grounds.
But, look, the same people are in power now in Washington, above all Bolton, who were in power in 2002-3. And the same language is coming out about Iran as did over Iraq. Now, remember what happened with Iraq, after which you were extraordinarily distinguished and far-sighted about, I would say, is it led to the destruction of a functioning country, the rise of al-Qaeda, not just al-Qaeda, which was almost finished in 2002. It was accompanied by a series of lies. It was utterly horrific. Now, what are they going to do? What will they do to Iraq? They're too cowardly. Remember, they won't send in troops like they did with Iraq. I embedded with American troops, and they were courageous and brave men. But they won't do that again. They will just bomb, and they will bomb, and they will bomb. And they will destroy they won't break Iran, but they will destroy the infrastructure, and they will set, of course, they will try and use this fake organization, the MEK, and so forth, to break up bits of it. What's that a recipe for? I mean, if you destroy structures and state structures and institutions, you're saying, hello, yet another Middle Eastern country is going to be an attempt to destroy it. Now, why? And it will lead, of course, to mass terrorism. Of course, it's bound to, because what else is going to happen? Yeah,
but the Iranians will fight back, of course. They have their own missiles. They have the ability...
Well, they will, but that's more bloodshed and horror, isn't it?
Yes,
I mean, but who's got the bigger military strength? Right, obviously, America does.
Well, of course, yes. But a key point is, and some of those busily putting billboards up around London should take note. Iran cannot fight the United States, but it can fight America's closest allies in the Persian Gulf.
I mean, I don't even want to think about it. Remember the last time they attacked a major Middle Eastern country? What followed?
Yes.
The horror, the suffering, the disasters for the world, just the human tragedies. And I I fear that there is clearly highly intelligent and military muscle behind this. It's got to be a possibility, and we really, and I would like to see Britain speaking out much more strongly against this kind of recklessness.
Britain is against it, isn't it?
Britain is against it, but we should be talking about against it much, much more strongly. It is very reminiscent now. We are the neoconservatives, the group of people strategists who drove the war into that unnecessary war against Iraq, are back in business. They want a war against Iran. The consequences for everybody will be absolutely terrible. And we need to start to pull ourselves together and look with clarity and understanding and maturity at this situation. I mean, you can see many of the British newspapers are now sort of talking this language. Many of the American newspapers. This is where Trump has support within some parts of the administration.
Peter Oborne, as always, a pleasure to hear your dulcet tones and your crystal clear analysis. Thanks for joining us. A London local radio station back on DAB says, just switched on talk radio, didn't realise George Galloway was going to be standing in for the Independent Republic of Mike Graham. Is this all week or just today? It's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. And Ian says, George, on a lighter note, in this sultry hot weather, is the only answer a mug of your finest builder's tea? Well, I drink tea all the time in the hottest of weather. 0344 499 1000. You heard the man. Am I playing wrong? If you think so, hit the dial. 0344 499 1000. All callers, of course, are welcome. Peter in Wigan has rung, and now he's on the air. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, hi, George.
Hi.
Thanks for having me on.
Welcome.
I just want to say a few words about the so-called white helmets
yes.
in Syria.
Yes.
And I actually prepared a few notes before your show, so I might be repeating one or two points that some of your
That's
earlier...
all right, don't worry.
But first of all, I want to say that the media coverage, particularly the BBC, is absolutely disgraceful because they always refer to the terrorists as rebels.
Yes.
And that they talk about the white helmets being in the rebel areas. They're in the terrorist areas. They're embedded with the terrorists.
Yes.
Now, in this instance, Israel has once again
excuse me, Peter.
exposed its illegal involvement in the conspiracy.
Peter, excuse me 1 second. I just wanted to make this point. The journalists who are writing this stuff, their own colleagues were murdered in these rebel areas, had their heads cut off on camera in these rebel areas, and their heads were picked up by the white helmets.
Yeah.
Amazing, isn't it?
It is amazing. But, I mean, what we've got to remember, George, is who set up the white helmets in the first place. They were founded in 2013 with an annual budget of more than 30 million.
That buys a lot of helmets.
Yeah, and they received funding. Initially, the funding came from the UK, but they also received funding from the United States and from other Western governments. And as I said, initially, the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office was the largest single source through the Mayday Rescue Foundation that was established by former Army officer James Le Mesurier.
Same as the great actor from Dad's Army.
Yeah. He's a UK security specialist, in inverted commas.
Yes.
And he's a British military intelligence officer who's been involved in NATO intervention theatres, including Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Lebanon, occupied Palestine, Syria. Now there are reports of Le Mesurier franchising the white helmets to other parts of the world, including Africa and Brazil and places like that, where he's actively recruiting. Who knows? Some of the people they bring to the UK and to other European countries may well end up with well-paid jobs as mercenaries going around the world to do the same kind of chopping jobs that they've done in Syria. He's also been placed in high-profile posts at the United Nations, the European Union, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And I think people should know this. They should know where these white helmets actually came from and what they're doing. They stand by while, I think you've said this earlier, while priests are being killed, Christians are being killed, and Syrian soldiers are being killed. And in fact, many of them are involved in the killing themselves. They're embedded with terrorist groups. And I think it's absolutely disgraceful that the British media, or the Western media, shall we say, are standing by. They know what's going on, and allowing Israel to whip in there quick and get their boys out.
Well, to be fair, Israel, according to Netanyahu, Israel was asked to rescue these people by Britain, France, and the United States.
Yeah, and it was portrayed as the first time they've intervened in Syria, which, as we all know, is an absolute pack of lies, because they have bombed Syria on a regular basis.
You see, I don't. I have no hatred in my heart for James Le Mesurier, because I know that such people, spooks, adjuncts to the deep and secret state, have always existed. He's like a character from a Graham Greene novel.
Yeah.
The hatred in my heart is towards those journalists whose own colleagues had their heads sliced from their bodies with the active collaboration of these white helmets, writing about them as if they were white hats, white horse, somehow a force for good.
Yeah.
That is just completely unforgivable to me.
Well, the latest incident where we saw them involved wasn't rescuing anybody, but it was a staged incident in Ghouta where they claimed that chemical weapons had been used, and it was later proved that they'd forced children to participate.
Yeah.
And that incident justified the US sending hundreds of missiles,
and Britain and France,
hundreds of millions of dollars in a massive missile attack on Syrian government targets.
Yep.
And this is what's going on. And when I listen to the BBC, I can't even watch the BBC now, because you have people sitting there and talking matter of fact, like, oh, the Novichok, that was made in Russia.
Yeah.
There's no evidence whatsoever for any of this nonsense, and the media is the biggest.
It's the biggest problem. I'm in no doubt about that. Peter, you're breaking up now, but thanks for a very erudite call. Frank in Rickmansworth says, George, great show. We'll have to stop listening to the local London radio station. I'm incensed that you were expelled from the Labour Party for exposing the lies that got us into the Iraq War. Yet Margaret Hodge is not expelled for telling lies about Jeremy Corbyn being anti-Semitic. That's been doubled down today, apparently, on Radio 4 by Margaret Hodge, and added to on this very radio station earlier this morning from someone perhaps aptly known as Baroness Hayter, who happens to be sitting on Labour front bench, on Jeremy Corbyn's front bench. Julie says, good morning, George. Great show as usual. Like many people, I'm absolutely appalled by the behaviour of Margaret Hodge towards Jeremy Corbyn. Her behaviour is tantamount to verbal and psychological abuse, not to mention being libellous. But it was carefully said in Parliament and is therefore not capable of being libellous. She has, without question, brought the party into disrepute. Therefore, she has to be expelled. It is utterly mind-blowing how she has a position in government after her track record regarding the child abuse scandal in Islington. She clearly does not have the most basic fundamental prerequisites to be a lawmaker. Keep up the good work, George. Like Jeremy Corbyn, you really are a good and principled man. Signed, Julie from Islington. Thank you, Julie. John MacDonald's comments this morning, however, make it clear that she will not be disciplined, and perhaps worse is in store for the rest of us. Joanne Henry says, I always imagine I don't agree with you on most things. Then when I listen, I find you very convincing and compulsive, especially on the Novichok conspiracy and the white helmets and other Islamists today. Fascinating. Well, Joanne, you need to listen more often. 03444991000. Now, at this moment of tectonic shift potentially happening under our feet on the British political scene, it's vital that the best brains and the best pens are assembled. We've already had Peter Oborne. Now we've got Dan Hodges. Dan, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Pleasure as always, George.
Now, can you solve a mystery for me right up top? Because I was talking about Dad's Army recently. Was your dad in Dad's Army?
No, he wasn't. But he did work with Jimmy Perry, who wrote Dad's Army.
Indeed.
And my understanding is that the officious air raid warden, Hodges, was named after him. Because Jimmy Perry,
he's a great character, by the way.
He is a great character. Jimmy Perry used to regard my dad. My dad was the stage manager, and as such was a very officious stage manager, and that's where it came from.
Don't panic.
I don't know if it's true.
Well, look, I was at a dinner the other night organised by Jim Davidson of Care After Combat, who's a good friend of mine, and I was sat within throttling distance of Britain's Defence Secretary, and I shouted out, "Don't tell him your name, Pike!" But because nobody knew who Gavin Williamson was in a military dinner, nobody quite got the joke. But Dan, now you said yesterday in your column, Unmissable, I read it every week, that you made the point you were a Remainer, but you were never a Ramoner. But you've come round to the view that the only way out of this admittedly horrendous, tremendous logjam is for another referendum. Don't you think that would be extraordinarily divisive and inconclusive? Because whatever the result, the deep fissure in Britain over the European Union would continue to exist.
Well, as I said in the piece, I mean, I agree with you. There are major problems with the second referendum, and you're absolutely right. It's even the proposal of it, as we've seen, is very divisive. But I don't really see what the alternatives are. I mean, as you said, I was a very staunch Remainer, but the result was the result, and I was of the view that we had to respect the result, and that the Leave camp had won a small but decisive victory. But as I also said in my piece, with victory comes responsibility, and there was a responsibility on those that had advocated Brexit and campaigned for Brexit to then implement in a practical, pragmatic way the result as defined by the wishes of the British people. And what we've seen and what we continue to see is politicians of all persuasions are simply unable to do that. I mean, the politicians have blown it. They cannot find a way of moving Brexit forward. So it seems to me we have only one option. If the politicians can't break the logjam, and if the politicians can't do their job, then again, we're going to have to hand the responsibility for getting us out of this mess to the British people. And that I see as the only way forward.
Well, I agree with all of that, except there isn't only one option, there's two. The traditional way of dealing with a government that can no longer pass its measures in Parliament is to have a general election. Yet you explicitly came out against that in your piece.
Well, for two reasons. One, as you know, I think a change of government to Jeremy Corbyn would, in my view, be catastrophic for all the reasons we've discussed in the past. But let's set that to one side for a moment. Even if we did have a new election and we did have a Labour government, the reality is, and you know this to be the case, George, the Labour Party is basically as divided,
even more divided, actually.
So, well, no, I think there's some truth in that. I mean, there are to an extent even greater divisions, because you have this clear, I mean, to put it simplistically, north-south divide between the views of Labour voters, Labour activists, Labour MPs in what we sort of rather simplistically call northern working class constituencies, and their view of Brexit, and the view of Brexit in South, particularly in London, particularly in the major cities where Labour has a base. And obviously, Labour has a particularly strong base and is particularly strong in London, which, if you like, is a sort of the Remain heartland. And within 10 seconds of Jeremy Corbyn crossing the threshold of Downing Street, we would see exactly the same fissures and divisions that are currently opening up in the Conservative Party, opening up in the Labour Party. With the extent this paralysis and this inability to move forward would continue.
Now, what did you make of the epic, I thought epic, polling evidence adduced by the Sunday Times yesterday and the reportage around it, which showed just how profound the extent of change amongst the electorate is? Just 12% of the country supports the Chequers proposals, which is your preferred proposal in the light of the fact that we're leaving at all. And 2 to 3 times that are against it. Huge percentage of the Conservative vote, almost 40% of the Conservative vote, said they'd be ready to vote for, as it were, a pure Brexit party. The potential for the growth of a kind of new UKIP, UKIP 0.2 or 2.0. These were all pretty profound signposts, weren't they?
Yes, and I think, I do agree with you that I think there is increasing evidence, overwhelming evidence, that the current structure of the two main parties and where they are both positioned politically is simply not going to be sustainable going forward. Now, at the moment, the current current political settlement is basically being held together. The fragments of it are being held together by the electoral system. But I think as we move forward and as we reach the crunch point on Brexit, and that's where we're getting to now, I mean, we're getting to the reality of Brexit. I think the question of whether both main parties can come out the other end of that process as currently constituted and intact in their current forms, I think there's got to be major doubts about that. I mean, I do think, obviously we've heard a lot of talk about a new party on the left, but I think we're increasingly, as you said, we're looking now at the prospect of a new party or parties on the right. Now, whether that's going to be a positive or a negative, remains to be seen, but it's certainly something that I think is very real and very live now.
Yeah, I mean, it would be natural, wouldn't it? You can be on the left like me, you can be in the centre like you, or you could be on the right like Farage. But the political system does not allow that plurality to be reflected.
No, I think that's right. But I think we're reaching the breaking point now. I think we're getting to the point where people on both sides, I mean, perfectly, particularly on the left, I mean, we are reaching a breaking point now where moderates who have attempted to remain within sort of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party to, as it were, fight the good fight, they are basically getting to the point now where they realise that this is just they're on a fool's errand, and I think we are reaching the point now where we are going to see some fragmentation on the left. Similarly, I think the spectacle of what I would call the kamikaze right-wing Brexiteers rushing around over the last 2 weeks screaming betrayal, betrayal, betrayal at the top of their voices. I think it's getting to the point now where that is going to start becoming embedded in a section of the Conservative electorate. And whatever deal is done and whatever the Brexit outcome, is simply not going to be enough to satisfy these kamikaze Brexiteers. So again, I think we are starting to look at a fragmentation on the right as well.
On the left, which you keep an eye on, you were formerly a Labour man yourself. How serious is the possibility of what, for shorthand, I might call a Blairite breakaway?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it a Blairite breakaway because obviously, I think I would be part of the breakaway, and I myself broke from Blair quite a while ago. But I mean, I certainly think, as I've said, I mean, particularly, I mean, I think the sort of the anti-Semitism issue within the Labour Party is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I mean, I've been very critical of the so-called moderates and the fact that they've come out against what I would regard as the very obvious anti-Semitism, have pledged enough is enough, have pledged to stand with the Jewish community, have pledged that they would not let this stand. And up until this point, they have let it stand. But I do think the current sort of row about the IHRA definition and the fact that it's quite clear that Jeremy Corbyn and those around him have no intention of addressing the concerns of the Jewish community. I think that it will take a bit more time, but I think ultimately that's going to be the catalyst for the fracture, because even if the politicians and the MPs don't move, I think a significant enough number of ordinary Labour members are themselves saying enough is enough. They are becoming politically homeless. And as a result of that, some sort of party is going to have to emerge to sort of address and give them a political home. And
what sort of numbers? I saw a number, quite a small number actually, between 12 and 20 this week. I would have thought it was a rather larger number than that, given that 172 Labour MPs voted no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn not all that long ago, 2016. What sort of numbers do you think are involved?
Are we talking about MPs?
MPs, yes.
I think, well, my understanding is if you were going to get an initial breakaway, primarily on the Labour side, I think you would probably get a dozen initially. But then once the break had been made, and a new party, whatever it is, started to get a degree of political success, got a degree of sort of favourable publicity, got a bit of momentum, I think that would start to increase. I mean, at the moment, you have to understand that the break amongst Labour MPs, the initial stage would be Labour MPs who basically took the decision they cannot, in good conscience, work for and allow Jeremy Corbyn to be elected, and that at a minimum they see a Jeremy Corbyn-led government as at least as great an evil as a continuing, Theresa May.
Well, Woodcock said at the weekend that he would prefer a Theresa May premiership to a Corbyn one.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's the initial stage, and I think there would be you probably have around about a dozen MPs who would possibly be prepared to publicly sign up to that. But then, as I said, I am less pessimistic in the current environment about, certainly in the short term, what a breakaway political party of either hue would do. I think certainly a moderate sort of centre-left political party, I think we would quickly see it polling, sort of high to mid-teens in terms of the polls. And it's not inconceivable we could see an SDP scenario where they start coming close or possibly even winning by-elections, and that would give us sort of momentum. That would give momentum. Obviously, when you get to a general election, that's an entirely different scenario. So, which why I say I think what we would be looking at would potentially be a staged process.
Well, good luck with that. I've been there before. Frankly, I look forward to it, as I think do you. Dan Hodges, commentator for the Mail on Sunday. Thanks for joining us. The Communicipalist says, I've great respect for Jeremy Corbyn, a genuine politician, which is exactly why he's been turned on by the rabble. But I'm exasperated with Labour leadership apparent passivity in the face of endless vicious treachery and under total mainstream media attack. I'm George Galloway. I'm in for Mike Graham. It's the mother of all talk shows. And I also want to hear from you. 0344 499 1000. That's 0344 499 1000. Call us. We'll take your number. We'll call you back. Needn't cost you more than a penny or two. As promised, we're joined now by Vanessa Beeley, a journalist who's been there everywhere in Syria and has talked to literally thousands of Syrian people, and is a rather better judge of character of the White Helmets than those stooge journalists in Britain who, notwithstanding the Al-Qaeda whose ambulance brigade the White Helmets are, cut the heads off their very own journalistic colleagues, are writing paeans of praise in the British media today about them. Vanessa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, George. Thank you for having me on.
Now, the White Helmets are coming to France and coming to Britain. What could possibly go wrong?
Indeed, what could possibly go wrong? And you're absolutely...
Alas, we just lost Vanessa. We'll try and get her back. This is, of course, in reference to a story that the 800 White Helmets were evacuated by Israel at the request of Donald Trump, President of France. I almost said Nicolas Sarkozy there, but I never thought I'd say Francois Hollande. Isn't it funny how he has entirely disappeared? I mean little Macron, the dancing boy of France, and I mean Theresa May of Great Britain. They asked Netanyahu to rescue 800 White Helmets so that we could bring them here. What could possibly go wrong is what I asked Vanessa Beeley, the veteran journalist based a lot of the time in Syria. And when we get her back on the line, we'll continue with that. But let me read some of the material that's coming in. The Communicipalist says, I've great respect for... No, I've done that one. Marie says, D.H. Lawrence was the greatest poet of the 20th century, a working-class man, rare for the times, whose nature poems, written with the background of industrial Britain, would not look out of place now on the blue planet. The Bare Bones says, you'll remember him, Bare Bones, the Bear Grylls look-alike, the ultra-hard guy, the ultra-hard guy who likes to send abuse in but never wants to call. Bear, here's the number, 0344 499 1000. He says, in case you're interested, George Galloway is risking Moscow ire to tell us how nice Iran is. All that money from Press TV given to George and Jeremy. Good times. Except you weren't listening, Bear. Far from telling you how nice Iran is, I just told you that just this day I've just turned down an invitation to visit them, precisely because it isn't all that nice. But then you hear, don't you, what you want to hear. Vanessa is back on the line. Vanessa, I was just asking you, what could possibly go wrong with 800 of the ambulance brigade of Al-Qaeda and ISIS coming into our country? Unfortunately, we've lost her again. Sean Caden says, it's an astonishing tweet from Trump re Iran. Dr. Strangelove language in 2018 is very, very dangerous and will lead us to ruin. Sean goes on, the tweet from Trump re Iran is pure Dr. Strangelove. Bob Justice says, the White Helmets, how very Hollywood. Another last-minute escape for the ambulance service of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, Army of Islam. I'd forgotten them. The Army of Islam. Did you, dear taxpayer, ever imagine that your taxes, hard-earned, would be being shipped to something called the Army of Islam? That's what it's called. Jaish al-Islam, Army of Islam, paid for by you. Thanks, Bob, for that. Let's take a call from Cyril in Beddington, one of the great legends of my, well, getting on for 15 years now in this very building. Cyril, welcome.
Hi, George. How you going?
Good, good. Nice to hear from you as always. Go on.
Yeah, this sort of ramping up of the Iran rhetoric is getting a bit scary, but I mean, I spoke to you many, many years ago, and I've always suspected that this was the case, but they just needed the right conditions to do it, and it's coming. It's definitely coming. It's always been coming. It's
well, Peter Oborne was very clear, wasn't he, that the critical mass has been achieved.
It is. They've got their man in place. I mean, I was sceptical and, initially, I mean, I hated the Clintons and I thought anything would be better, but I couldn't put my finger on what Trump really represented. But I think now it's beginning to crystallize. I mean, he's obviously this stooge for the military-industrial complex, corporate America, big oil, and the Zionist agenda. I think he's thick as thieves with the Israeli government and Netanyahu and stuff. And the Iran thing's always been on the agenda. I mean, they've got the world's largest untapped supply of natural gas. I mean, also
it's a pretty big prize, isn't it?
Oh, it's enormous. And you imagine if they could install a puppet or a client government in there and build a pipeline across Iraq and through Syria, get it to the Med. That would sort of like negate Putin's the Nord Stream or whatever it is. I mean, it's geopolitics at its worst, and there's big prizes there, And
of course, there's a lot of ifs and buts in that, Cyril. First of all, you've got to defeat Iran, and only by bombing. And Iran's got lots of bombs itself, tipped on the end of rockets that can go quite far.
Oh, it will be, it will make, Iraq look, like a small beer.
Yeah. Chicken feed,
and also, the Chinese are not going to stand back, and nor are the Russians. But it's as if they've got their man in place. I mean, under the Democrats, I think America's always had the kinder, gentler machine gun hand, and I think it actually just rearms and gets ready. I'm sounding really cynical, but it gets ready to put another Republican government in. And it's all part of the agenda. I mean, it's as clearly defined in Project for a New American Century as Hitler's intentions were in Mein Kampf. It's always been part of the agenda. They've got their man in place, and it's coming. And we, as a weak country now, we're a laughing stock, I think. A weak country will be forced into it to give them some sort of legitimacy, as ever. That's what they do. They use us to give them some sort of kind of face to the world, and it's coming. It's very sad. And, I think in a matter of, before even February we'll be in there. That's a great time to bomb in the desert. That's normally when they do stuff like that. So give it, 6-8 months, it's going to kick off.
My goodness. Cassandra, we all are, except this time I fear we're right. Cyril in Beddington, thank you very much indeed. Simon T. James says, what's the matter with John McDonnell? Jeremy has the membership behind him. You tolerate Mrs. Hodge behaviour, then you open the door for behaviour to get worse. They are not interested in a Labour government. Take them on. I think I called it on Twitter this morning a profound error. And by profound error, I mean this. I'm aware that compromises often have to be made in politics and tactics are important, but not as important as strategy. And the people we're talking about here have a strategy. This has nothing to do with anti-Semitism and everything to do with Jeremy Corbyn. From the day and hour that it looked like Jeremy Corbyn was going to become the Labour leader, this group was dedicated utterly, above all else, to his destruction. And they have tried everything from Czechoslovakia to anti-Semitism and then back round again. These people are determined to destroy Jeremy Corbyn. You cannot keep a wolf happy. until you're dead and in its belly. And therefore, when Dan Hodges is telling you that a dozen to 15, I saw the figure of 12 to 20, Labour MPs are preparing to break away into a Chuka Umunna centre party, polling in the mid-teens, let's hope Dan's right for once, then better that it were done quick, by capitulating to the constant subversion of the Corbyn leadership. I'm afraid Labour is merely making not just a rod, but the severest of lacerating weapons for its own back. Chris says, how can anyone with an ounce of morality support war with Iran, whilst at the same time accusing Russia of meddling in other countries? It's insanity. Good point, Chris. Russell Brake says the publicly funded state broadcaster, the BBC, continues voicing the government propaganda without question. The saintly named white helmets are ISIS. We don't want them here. Governments are too thick to learn from history. We'll keep sticking our oar in the Middle East. It'll be Iraq all over again. Russell, the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. Now, third time lucky, I think we have connected securely to Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa.
Hi, George.
Let's hope so. I was asking what could possibly go wrong with 800 white helmets coming to your country and mine?
Well, I mean, yeah, this is a very interesting question. I actually did an interview on Al Mayadeen last night, and during that, the other guests on the show were a Dr. Turki Hassan from Damascus and a Dr. Hayat Atiyah Al-Huwayak from Jordan. Now, what was interesting is through them and from intelligence on the ground, we heard that actually it was a greater number of exceptional refugees that transited into Israel, probably up to 3,000. And among them were a number of agents from the UAE, from Qatar, and from Saudi. And so clearly, the sort of exceptional evacuation of the NATO member state multi-million-dollar financed white helmets was camouflaged for perhaps NATO member state special forces, Gulf state special forces to leave an area that is clearly just about to be fully liberated by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies. Now, of those 3,000, I've also been told that only 442 have actually arrived in Jordan. So that raises the question, where are the other 2,500? Are they waiting in Israel to be picked up to be taken to Jordan? Or have they, of course, transited out of Israel or been, let's say, repatriated into Israel potentially, where there are Israeli militants operating in the south? We highly suspect that is the case. Certainly, the militant factions were acting as proxies for Israel in that region, as we know.
Well, just for those who think that might be a conspiracy theory too far, you're too young to remember. But Israel had a full army called the South Lebanon Liberation Army for decades. I mean, a full army. I mean, tens of thousands of people who, when South Lebanon was liberated, were repatriated to Israel, where they still live.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm not that young, George, but thank you. Yeah, and I mean, until the campaign by the Syrian Arab Army to liberate the south, of course, there has been endless accounts of basically when the armed militants came under attack by the Syrian Arab Army, they would basically launch shells into the Israeli-held or occupied areas in order for Israel to return fire against the Syrian Arab Army. We also know, of course, that Israel has treated many of these militant factions, such as the Free Syrian Army, but also as Al-Qaeda, Nusra Front, in Israeli hospitals before releasing them back into the southern provinces to act as, of course, custodial guardians of the illegally annexed Golan territories. So, I mean, this is, it's not so much of a far-fetched conspiracy theory. And also, I mean, Israel has recently been known to shoot Palestinian medics in the back and to, in cold blood, murder Palestinian children. And yet here we have the Zionist regime basically facilitating an exceptional evacuation of NATO member state-financed intelligence assets that go under the name of the White Helmets, and who have effectively for 5 years in Syria offered services as human shields and demonizers of the Syrian government for Al-Qaeda and its associated splinter factions and rebrands.
Well, let's be fair. Netanyahu was clear enough on television. He said he did this because he was asked to by the British, French, and the United States governments. So let's take him at his word and assume, therefore, that some of these people are destined for here, just like the so-called Libyan Islamic Fighting Group were secreted away, not so secretly, in Manchester for many years. And look what happened at the end of that story. Are we not in danger from bringing the ambulance brigade, the human shields of Al-Qaeda and the alphabet soup of Islamist fanaticism in Syria into our own countries? Don't we have enough of these types here already?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I actually tweeted out yesterday, what's next for the White Helmets? Are they going to be given an OBE? Are they going to be given a consultancy position in the London Fire Brigade? Are they going to be absorbed and infiltrated back into UK society, and in France, of course, Germany and Canada, that are the other countries that are offering to take them? Interesting that the United States is not having any White Helmets back on American soil.
They're probably on the banned list.
Despite the fact that, of course, Heather Nauert recently thanked the White Helmets personally in a press briefing at the UK State Department for the help they've given to the US government and its regime change operation inside Syria, and the help also that they gave to their proxies. I mean, that was clear from the statement that is basically what the US was saying. The leader of the White Helmets was recently awarded at the John McCain Institute at the Sedona Forum, and yet White Helmets apparently are not allowed back on American soil. So that also speaks volumes. But yes, I mean, again, we're at high risk of allowing uninvestigated members of an organization that is known to be militant. It's known to be violently sectarian. We need to remember it called for the extermination of the villages of Kafraya and Four, Shia Muslim villages marooned in Idlib and under siege by Nusra Front and a number of other factions since March 2015, and who were actually suicide bombed in Rashdi and Aleppo in 2017. And the White Helmets were present there and are accused by those civilians of abducting their children from the scene of that hideous attack that left over 120 civilians, mostly children, dead and dying. And those dead and dying children were piled into trucks by the White Helmets and taken away from the scene. But, this is erased from our consciousness by the Western media, who, as you said, do nothing other than act as a PR agency, not that they don't have enough themselves, for the White Helmets. I mean, the White Helmets as an organization has 150 media experts working on its team. The UK ambulance force doesn't have that number of media advisors. I mean, this is insanity. Our government, through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, has poured almost £39 million into this organisation. And that is without taking into account all of the private funds that have been set up to further divert taxpayers' money to this organisation that is effectively an auxiliary for Al-Qaeda and its various militant associates in Syria.
Vanessa Beeley, I'm glad we finally connected. Thank you for that testimony. Chris M. says a preposterous suggestion by Dan Hodges to have a second referendum. There will never be a clear majority, seen in the 1975 EEA referendum. How long should this dynamic be? Best of 1 million? His real narrative is taking blame, responsibility from the Tories. And Sarah says, haha, sorry, Dan is wrong. Vast numbers of members back Corbyn. We will stay. Well, we keep hearing about people leaving, but nobody ever gives us their names or their numbers. Simon James says Hodges has no evidence of plenty of members leaving the party. He also ignores the fact that plenty of Jewish members support Jeremy Corbyn and view this as fake smearing. Too many non-Jewish people speaking for the Jews. An Omuna party polling mid-teens. Keep dreaming. And he goes on, Hodges, no, I've already done that one. Liberty says, what a Brucey bonus. George Galloway standing in on talk radio. And it's all week. Enjoying the show. Get dialing 0344 499 1000. Chris Phillips is a terrorism specialist and managing director of the IPPSO. And he joins us now. Chris, thanks for that.
Hello, George.
Hi, mate. Now, Mr. Charlie Rowley, thank the Lord, survived the latest Novichok attack, making it 3 out of 4 who've survived it. And he's been taken to a safe house. Not many people can understand why, but it gets murkier when you learn from his brother that he's being denied access to television. Why would that be?
I've got absolutely no idea, George. But what I would say is that the main thing about this man is protection, to make sure that he doesn't come to any ill, anything unlikely happens to him. I think the thing we need to bear in mind is that investigations like this are really long-winded. They take a huge amount of time in order to piece together all the bits of evidence, all the bits of CCTV to try to work out exactly what's happened. And I'm sure that this guy is will probably want to be back out and about, but maybe for his own safety, he's been shielded.
Yeah, he might just want to watch the news, though.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've got no idea why that would be the case. Maybe. I mean, I don't know the situation of his, well-being and how well he actually is. But yeah, you're right. I can't see any reason why he wouldn't want to watch the news.
Well, I hope he's back on Sky Sports by the time the new football season starts. Seems the least we can do for him. I had a friend, an American journalist, a right-wing American journalist connected to Breitbart and Bannon and therefore Trump, who took his camera down to Salisbury just last week, Wednesday, I think. And he interviewed, what he said, dozens of people. He didn't find one single person in Salisbury that believes the official narrative on the Novichok affair. Are you surprised at that?
Well, I would be very surprised. I mean, I don't know what those individuals that he interviewed think is the true story. But the one thing I'm pretty confident of is that this stuff is so unusual, so difficult to get access to. I think the investigation will probably find that it's been brought over to the UK in a perfume bottle. I would also anticipate that it's been discarded, and probably discarded after the suspect saw that the Skripals had been impacted by it and thought that they should then make their escape. So I'm very much down the line of thinking that this is that type of inquiry. And we've seen other incidences, of course, in the UK, such as the Litvinenko, which are linked directly to Putin. So I think, I don't have any doubts myself, George. I'm sure you do.
I do a lot, but we don't have time to canvass them all. But let me ask you some obvious questions. We were told it was gel smeared on a doorknob, but you can't smear gel on a doorknob from a perfume bottle, can you?
Well, you have to carry things around with you, George. You have to get it from A to B in a container that's going to be able to be used. I don't know exactly whether the word smear is the right word or whether it was sprayed onto the door I do not know that.
Yeah.
But I think we mustn't go down the route of thinking that there's some big conspiracy in the UK to achieve this sort of stuff. Listen, this is serious stuff, and I think the use of Novichok or any nerve agent in the UK is a really scary thing.
Yeah, of course. Let me ask you about Novichok then. If this is a very expensive and 10 years in the making, Novichok assassination technique, as Boris Johnson said that it was, why did it fail 3 times out of 4? And why would you discard in a park many miles from the Skripals' home such valuable and potentially incriminating material?
Well, I think these are all big questions that need to be answered. How much needs to be put onto the person in order for it to have the right impact? Whether the treatment of those people was so quick because of the skills and knowledge of the hospital they were dealt with. We don't know any of this. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of opinion out there that would question it. But I think certainly the lady that did spray it on herself in some quantities obviously was killed. So it is a deadly substance. It is not made elsewhere. And the Russians have got form for doing this kind of thing. So I think you've got to go where the evidence tells you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, none of those facts you just stated are true. Novichok can be made by any chemistry student in any university lab in the world. I have that from the professor of chemistry from Cornell University, no less. But as I said, Chris, we're not here to have a punch-up, you and me, and the hour is late anyway. Let me ask you about the investigation. I take your point. These investigations move glacially, as they must. I mean, even in a car crash, the gathering of evidence and the difference in perspective from all the witnesses to the car crash are difficult to sift. How many officers are working on this case, do you think? And how long would the glacial process likely take? Are we talking months or are we talking years?
Well, if you look back at the Litvinenko case, which was actually a bit more straightforward, actually, because they were able to trace and follow the substance that was actually used. That took years to actually come out with an answer as to who exactly did it and how they did it. I think this will take a long, long time, and I think we've got to be realistic about this. No one's ever going to be tried for this. No one's ever going to go to court. But I think the evidence will point in a particular direction, and I think we do have to put some trust in our authorities. The number of officers involved will be enormous, and it won't obviously just be police officers. Police will be paying the sort of main role, but there'll be much more done by MI5, MI6, and GCHQ than we can imagine.
But it is the Met, isn't it? It's not the Salisbury police.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's simply because of the skill set and the number of officers required to run an inquiry like this. And I think the other part of the aspect to this really, George, is the fact that it's a public safety issue. This stuff is dangerous, as has been seen. And I certainly don't know. I don't know whether the police actually know yet how much was transported and whether there's any more about, this has all got to be part of the bigger inquiry that's going on.
Chris, thanks very much for joining us. Chris Phillips, security expert, terrorism specialist, managing director of IPPSO. Now, tweet of the day is this from the Communicipalist. Of course, it's possible that Charlie Rowley hasn't got a television licence, hence the 24/7 police guard. Brilliant, as is my final guest of the day. Not just a brilliant comedian, in my view, a comic genius, but perhaps even more significantly, the CEO of Care After Combat, which, as I said earlier, picks up the pieces of the service personnel who fall on the very hardest of times into what is euphemistically called the justice system, but might otherwise be described as the clanger in prison. It's not glamorous. It's not the sort of thing that's photographed in Hello magazine, although when I was at his dinner the other night, we looked pretty glamorous, Jim, didn't we, in our tuxedos?
We look very good. You especially, George.
Thank you, my dear friend. Now, I think what you are doing is so important that I try to give it every airing that I can. And I think the dinner probably raised a right few quid, but not remotely nearly enough money. You're acting essentially as a probation service in an era where the probation service is under severe squeeze. You're acting as a social services department, ditto. The state should be funding your efforts, shouldn't it?
Well, I think it should. I mean, normally, how wonderful it would be to be like Help for Heroes and have £240 million in the bank. We don't have that luxury because, as you rightly said, George, we're at the dirty end of the stick. We look after guys that have been in prison. And when I say we look after them, we just make sure they don't go back. But if you stand on the corner with a box next to a little old lady selling a poppy, you'd rather buy a poppy than give the money to someone who's perceived to be a baddie. But we don't raise enough. That's the problem. And the other evening at the ball, we raised a nice few quid, thanks to everybody being there, you included. And I sat next to the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, who really, really wants
Don't tell him your name, Pike.
That's him. That's him. That's exactly him. And he's quite nice. And he's from up north. And every now and then a bit of north comes in, which is quite interesting to speak to. Anyway, he was saying that we must help you get some money from the Ministry of Justice. And the Ministry of Justice is saying we haven't got any money. Speak to the Armed Forces Covenant Fund. And the woman on my table from the Armed Forces Covenant Fund said, we're not doing anything for the criminal justice system veterans in this year's package full of money. There's no libel money next. I've come up now, I'm in Lincolnshire to meet with the NHS. We're working together with them there, but there's just not enough money. And the sad thing is, George, we're not talking about policy here, as you and I well know, and we share that, but we're talking about young men and women that have really lost the way, and it's so easy to get them back, but it just costs money.
It's a stitch in time argument, isn't it? If you don't help these people, they will be back and back and back again in the prison system at vastly greater expense. It costs more to keep a man in prison than it does to send a boy to Eton.
Well, it does. It does. And the beds are more comfortable in prison, I'm told. But anyway, they're saying it's 37,000 quid to keep someone in a prison, but that's a category D and a C. These high-risk prisons. Nazil Azir was on my table. He was the Crown Prosecution Service boss from the Northeast. Ironically, him and I met through U-Tree from other sides of the fences. But he's a big help with helping us now. And he said years ago to your friend, Mr. Blair, he said, Mr. Blair, it costs £1 million for a murder trial. Now, if we can nip these things in the bud, you never know what these guys are going to do if they're not helped. And they need help, George.
Very much so. What numbers are we talking about? How many of our personnel end up in the prison system?
Now in England and Wales, because as you know, Scotland has been devolved, so we don't get their figures. But we have 3,500 and between 3,500 and 4,000 veterans in prison. And we have looked after in the last 2 years, pretty much full time, about 500 of those. And of those, we think that 200 of them have been released in the last 12 months, about 150 in the last 18 months. And we've reduced reoffending from 46% in the general prison population to 8%. And we think that's fantastic. But what did the Ministry of Justice say when I went to see Rory Stewart, the minister? Oh, we're not too sure about your figures. We look at them differently to yours. Well, hang on. We've got 8% of the people haven't reoffended of all the ones we've been let out. Doesn't take a genius to work that out. I don't know what's up, George. I think it's this. These young ministers like to square their desk away. It's no good them giving me $2.5 million a year to save them $200 million. They don't look at it like that, George.
Can't these people who are sitting on vast reserves, like Help for Heroes, 240 million quid in the bank, can't they square you up?
Well, I asked the fellow who actually formed Help for Heroes when we first got started, Bryn. And he said, well, we can't help you, Jim, because we help the injured, sick or wounded. So I said to him rather sarcastically, which didn't really cheer him up. I said, so if any of our guys walk around the exercise yard and get blown up, you'll come and help. Well, don't be like that, Jim. Well, hang on a minute. Help for Heroes does a fantastic job, but we've got 10 times the amount of people to look after, and it's in everybody's interests that these people don't reoffend and we fit them back into society.
Now, you had quite a galaxy there. You managed to get me and Lord NATO at the same table. You had Ian Duncan Smith
and Mike Penning sitting on your table as well.
Yes.
He was a bit grumpy, I think.
Yeah. He was. He didn't say hello to me all night, but I renewed my acquaintance with Lord NATO. It's only been a 43-year relationship we've had, crossing swords. Now we were crossing butter knives. But
well, that's good. A lot of water under the bridge, George.
Well, exactly.
What people don't get with you, they don't look into the intellect of what you're saying. This is about policy. That's what you're having to go at. And I told that audience the other evening.
Yes, you did, yes.
500 people that got a huge round of applause for you, is that you never, ever let the serviceman and the veteran down. And I will always thank you for that, George.
Thank you, Jim. Now, of course, I wish that you put as much time and as effectively as possible into Care After Combat, but I'd hate your comic talent to wither on the vine. You did a double act for about 10 minutes, entirely impromptu, on the stage with Bobby Davro the other night. And there wasn't a dry eye in the house. There wasn't an uncracked rib in the house. It was utterly hilarious. Now, I see that you and Davro and others are back on the stage. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, at the event in Apollo, which is the home of the young comics, Jethro said, I'd like to go there and show them young comics what's what. So Jethro from Cornwall, me, Mick Miller, the brilliant Mick Miller, Bobby Davro, and Mike Osmond, we're all getting together on the 10th of December at basically the Hammersmith Odeon it used to be in my day.
Yeah.
And we're raising money for all the money goes to Care After Combat.
Oh, I didn't know that. So all the money goes to the charity. That is terrific.
Every penny, mate.
Jim, can you reserve a couple of seats for me and the wife?
Absolutely, as long as you promise to introduce me on stage.
I promise to do that. And you know, no one can...
hand the tomatoes out.
Jim Davidson, comic genius, CEO of Care After Combat. May God bless you and your work. And your good lady, by the way, who you don't deserve. Mrs. Davidson, if you're listening, I was mightily impressed. Thanks very much for that. Tom Jarvis says, morning, big man. Dan Hodges predicting a dozen or so moderate Labour MPs will leave the party shortly. I pray to God that for once he's actually right. Andrew says, after Molinari's victory in the Open, golf will take off in Italy. A good punt for golf course construction companies. Great show. Thanks, Andrew, and the best of luck to golf in Italy. I don't play it myself. I take the old Scottish view that it's a good walk. Spoiled. Bob Justice says, whoa, beware a Democrat in Clinton promised to destroy Iran. Okay, Trump's fully on board. They've had him in Area 51 and replaced his walnut brain for a military microprocessor, a smaller conspiracy than the Globe-believing UK brings legitimacy to US war. And Kyle Rickards says, bringing the white helmets to the UK is like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. And this from our erudite correspondent in Kilmarnock, Samson. He says, whilst much of the coverage over Trump's tweet appears focused on his individual personality, his tone is indicative of increasingly bellicose language coming from the US establishment. For example, you'll remember Nikki Haley's speech to the UN regarding its opposition to the US recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Like a comic book supervillain, she sneered that the US will remember this day. Yes, she was taking names. As the appointment of the superhawk John Bolton to the post of National Security Advisor indicates, the US empire as a whole appears to be entering a new phase where it dispenses with more subtle means of control and rules by simple, naked fear. Well, I've got to tell you, they don't do fear in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Eva Working Class says, why were these white helmets under threat when many before have freely taken buses out of liberated areas, fleeing with the terrorists? And Peter says, I've been away, but I've heard we may be taking some of the white helmets. I couldn't believe it. They are known extremist militant supporters. They have been found to fabricate chemical weapons attacks. They have been found assisting militants in killing government forces, all funded by our government. Another disgrace, and more fanatics roaming our streets. But the real reason they want them out of Syria is in case some of them talk about what they were paid to do. And Barham says, why would you leave the only hard evidence, a perfume bottle full of Novichok, that could provide a link between the assassins and their country of origin? Answer, you do not, unless you want it to be found. Well, it's been a terrific show, I think. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And if you have, come back tomorrow morning at precisely the same time, 10 a.m., because I'll be standing in for the great Mike Graham. Tomorrow, Wednesday and Thursday. And back, God willing, on Friday night with my own show, the mother of all talk shows.